Welcome everyone to another webinar on making leadership mindful. This session, I'm really excited to invite a very special guest in Dr. Delia McCabe here. So Dr. Delia is based on the Gold Coast, and today she's going to be helping us understand nutritional neuroscience and essentially the nutrition that we need to support ourselves, especially in things like stress. So Dr. Delia has a PhD, and she shifted her research focus from clinical psychology to nutritional neuroscience upon discovering nutrition's clinical role in mental well-being while completing her master's. So Delia's research into the neurological effect of specific nutrients, especially on female stress, has been published in several peer-reviewed journals. She's regularly featured expert in the media, and her 2 internationally available books are available in 4 languages. So using her background in psychology, combined with evidence-based nutritional neuroscience and neurological perspectives, Delia supports behavior change and stress resiliency within corporates. So for individuals who want to optimize their brain health via online courses, workshops, and tailored events internationally. So I'm very excited and very grateful to have Delia here with us today. And without further ado, I'm going to pass over to her, and she's going to jump into this session for us so that we can maximize our time learning. So Delia, thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Alexis. Very grateful for the opportunity to spread my message, because I think it's a very important one. And at the end of the session, I'm sure that everybody here will agree with me. So thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to just share my screen right now. Can everybody see Making Leadership Mindful? Nutritional neuroscience for stressed leaders. After the last 18+ months, I'm sure everybody watching this presentation is aware of the fact that stress has touched our lives. And I think if we didn't understand stress before, I think we really understand it now at a much deeper level. So there are a few things that I'm going to be talking about today. And the first one is going to be about how stress impacts the brain, which I think is very important to understand, seeing as we use our brains all the time. And being leaders, being mindful, it's very important to consider that. The second thing you're going to get a little bit of a taste for is how nutrition and brain function and mental health are connected. It is a topic that is often discussed in the media and among people, but it's actually quite a complex subject. So I'm going to make it as simple as possible. So any of you here who've got a neuroscience background, bear with me, because I'm not going to go right into the nitty-gritty of some of the complexities about how the brain is actually wired, because we're learning more every single day, but I'm still going to go into enough detail for you to be able to walk away with actionable steps. And then the third thing you're going to learn is what kinds of food really create a healthy brain and emotional stability and mental clarity. But before we get to that, let's just talk about first things first. Phones off, have a notepad out, and any questions into the chat, as Alexis mentioned. But something about the notepad. Now, this is one of the things that I really miss about doing face-to-face workshops and presentations, because I've always found that at any event, people grab their notepads and start writing down furiously. And I always say to them, don't. I say, please don't write anything down, because you cannot write and listen at the same time. And the men often pop up and say, yeah, but women can, because they can multitask. And I say, that's another myth. It just looks like we can multitask, but we can't really. So I will ask you to get your notepad out when I want to explain a point really carefully. But other than that, I really encourage you to just listen to what I'm saying. Just have a look at the slides. Some of them do have words, which I'll read with you. And just consider what I'm saying instead of trying to remember what I've just said by writing it down. So talking about first things first, I just want to touch on what Alexis mentioned about why I turned my back on the talking cure for a moment. I was a young scholar. I was very pregnant with my first child. I was developing these questionnaires to find out why highly intelligent students were doing really poorly at school. And I came across a very weird anomaly. I discovered a very clear distinction between my experimental group and my observational group. Sorry, my control group. The experimental group, who were these children who were very smart but doing poorly at school, all loved junk food, and the children who were doing well at school and were very smart, my control group, didn't love junk food. And it's very seldom in research that you come across such a clear distinction. And I thought, wow, I need to investigate this a little bit more. But keep in mind, this was 25 years ago, and the researchers that were investigating nutritional neuroscience were very few and far between. And I had to take journal articles out and maybe highlight a sentence and try and find books related to the topic, which were very hard to find. I decided, being very pregnant with my first child, to take a little bit of time off before I opened my practice. And the rest, as people say, is history, because I discovered that what we eat impacts the brain directly and very, very critically. We need to investigate that to be able to optimize our intellect. So I wrote my thesis, mentioned in passing what I had discovered, but I didn't dive into it because my thesis was not about that. It was looking at the psychological variables. So in time, I do put my psychology hat on, so excuse me when I do, but my main focus in this talk is going to be about how nutrients impact brain function, and specifically related to stress, what that means for us. So let's just talk about first principles for a moment. Aristotle already understood when he said we learn more by understanding a subject's fundamental principles. Elon Musk has taken it further, and he's saying is now known worldwide, which is basically that we take first principles, which are a physics way of looking at the world, and we boil things down to fundamental truths. And Oscar Hammerstein in The Sound of Music made it really simple. Let's start at the very beginning, a really good place to start. So one of the things that leaders are probably aware of is that the part of their brain that they really rely on is their prefrontal cortex. And this is the part of the brain that we call the CEO of the brain. It's basically in charge of everything else, and the part of our brain that makes us truly human. So if you have to just walk with me through this list, what do leaders really want? They want to be able to think really clearly and creatively so as to be innovative. They want to problem solve optimally, and of course, in an ideal world, avoid problems via consequential thinking. They also want to optimally detect patterns and apply logic and reason optimally. And they want to inhibit thoughts and behaviors that compromise progress. They want to optimize learning and memory so that PFC can function optimally. And then, of course, mindfulness wants to be encouraged as well, because that helps us with focus, concentration, and with our relationships. But if I had to take this whole slide and go down to real first principles about what this means, it simply means two words. We want a brain that is optimally capable of connecting, and we want a brain that has lots of energy, because when it has lots of energy, it can more effectively connect all these different concepts together to help the brain work optimally, left and right hemisphere. So connectivity and energy is where our focus needs to lie. So let's dive into something right away. And I always call this, let's get the elephant out of the room first, because I normally leave this slide to the last slide when I'm doing in-person presentations, because by that time people have really relaxed and they feel calm and happy. And then suddenly I bring up the coffee slide and they go, oh goodness. And then I always say to people, do you want to know how coffee works? And 50% of the audience say yes, and the other 50% are shaking their head. So luckily I can't see your response now, but I gather that you're here today because you do understand that knowledge is power. So I'm simply going to show you how coffee works, and work with me through this slide as we have a look and see how it works. So the first thing to know about coffee is that it's a psychopharmacologically active compound. So is cocaine. And I'm not saying that they're exactly the same, but they have a similar effect, because when you consume coffee with caffeine in it, it gets converted into dopamine. And this is a feel-good neurotransmitter that's also called the motivator or pleasure neurotransmitter. It blocks a compound called adenosine, which needs to rise during the day to allow us to sleep optimally. Dopamine then gets converted into adrenaline, which gives us that very quick buzz, that feeling of focus and concentration, but it also causes a quick rise in blood sugar, followed by a dip in blood sugar and an increased desire to go to the bathroom, because caffeine is also a diuretic. And then we have a desire for more feel-good caffeine. So I'm here just to tell you how coffee works. Over the last 18 months, many people have experienced a desire for more coffee as they feel more exhausted. Whether it's COVID fatigue or just general stress and uncertainty, people have relied on coffee more and more. So I've got 2 slides to show you. I don't want you to be in this group of people, the people that are needing coffee regularly throughout the day to give their brain that spark of focus and concentration, which is hard earned. I'd rather you be part of this group of people who starts your day with your ritual coffee, setting your intentions for the day. You see, when you rely on coffee to be supplying energy, it is a very expensive form of energy because it requires adrenaline synthesis. And that is a challenge when we've already got a brain that has got too much adrenaline flowing through it. But before we get to that, let's really go back to basics and have a look at our neurons. We've got between 85 and 100 billion of these tiny little cells in our brain. They are so tiny that 20,000 of them can fit on the head of a pin. And the connections range from 10 to 20,000 between our neurons. So these are very tiny but very powerful cells that really dictate our life and our destiny, our cognition, our emotion, and our capacity to make a difference in the world. So they may be tiny, but they really are mighty. The thing about these neurons is that they never really touch each other. They jump across what we call a synaptic cleft. And they jump across that cleft with tiny little chemicals called neurotransmitters. And these neurotransmitters jump across this synaptic cleft using neurotransmitters that are powered by the chemicals that they are made up of and by electricity. So we call this a neurochemical impulse. So when people speak about electricity in the brain, it does exist and it's got a very important role to play. But I'll go back to this slide because the synapses are full of fat. And when they are made up of the right kind of fat, then those neurotransmitters are firstly synthesized optimally and also released from the synapse to jump across that cleft optimally as well. So these synapses made up of fat need to be made up of the right kind of fat. So just to keep in mind, 60% of the dry weight of the brain is made up of fat. And of that 60%, it needs to be a very specific kind of fat. 20 to 25% needs to be made up of polyunsaturated fatty acids. So every single time your neurons fire, which happens more than it is possible to count, those synaptic clefts are releasing neurotransmitters and receiving neurotransmitters, and the efficiency of them being able to do that depends on the kind of fat at the synapse. Now, this discussion just on fats and oils that I'm giving you the highlights of here, my normal presentation on this topic takes 3 hours. So you need to bear with me and just accept what I'm saying, because it is the truth and it's based on the actual biochemistry, the actual molecular structure of these fats and oils, which is going pretty deep, but I did say first principles today. So let's have a look at polyunsaturated fats. As a memory cue, I'd like you to remember polyunsaturated fats as precious fats. These are fats that are called essential fats because we have to get them from our diet. Our body cannot make them. Now, it is estimated today that 95% of the population is deficient in these fats. And there are a number of reasons for that. The first one is that farmers prefer not to grow these plants because they are cold weather crops and they can't sell them as optimally to food manufacturers because they go off very quickly. So those are 2 primary reasons why most people are deficient in these fats. Another reason is that people that live in landlocked areas and people that can't eat fish don't get this fat either. However, the discussion about fish and being a brain food, we will come back to later. But it's just important to keep in mind that relying on fish or relying on fish oil will not give you the right ratio of these essential fats. Because in the first 4 images, you can see they're chia seeds, flax seeds, green leafy vegetables. I'd like you to focus on those three for this moment. They are called alpha-linolenic fats. And we have the capacity to convert them into DHA and EPA, which is found in smash fishes. That is salmon, mackerel, anchovies, sardines, and herrings. So our body can do the conversion from those three plant forms of these essential fats into the DHA and EPA. That's the first point. In the second four images, you see walnuts, pumpkin seeds, sunflower seeds, and sesame seeds. These are omega-6 fats, whereas the other four are omega-3 fats. These omega-6 fats are just as crucial for brain function. In fact, if we don't have enough of them, we actually have a huge challenge because we cannot form memories. So long-term potentiation is hampered if we don't have enough of the omega-6s. Now, this is contrary to what the media tells us. They keep on telling us we've got too many omega-6s and we don't need them in our diet, that we only need omega-3s. This is a very basic myth, and it's a basic misunderstanding because the brain needs both omega-6 and omega-3 to function optimally. They've got different functions, but both are important. The challenge today is that most people are consuming a lot of sunflower seed oil and cottonseed oil as well, and even soya oil, but it is all being damaged in the processing. So by the time you get it and you use it in your home and your kitchen, it's already toxic. So you may be getting some omega-6, but it is already damaged, which means that when it finds its way into your body and into your brain, it comes along with toxic fat molecules like trans fats, polymerized fats, cyclized fats, and cross-linked fats. These are not fats that we want anywhere near our brain. So polyunsaturated fats, these are the ones we have to get in our diet and our body cannot make. The second group of fats, which most people are familiar with, is monounsaturated fats. And these are mostly from the Mediterranean. So use that as your memory cue. And most people are very, very familiar with olive oil and also with avocados. And often I hear people saying these are fantastic fats for the brain. Unfortunately, they aren't really the best fats for the brain. I've just explained that the polyunsaturated fats are good for the brain. These fats, the body can actually make. It can make monounsaturated fats. And the next slide, it can also make saturated fats. And that is the whole premise that the low-fat diet failed on, because it didn't take into account that when we eat too many carbohydrates, the body naturally converts them into saturated and monounsaturated fat. So these were the fats that weren't essential, but people now believe that you can eat them in vast quantities. This is also not true. If you don't have enough of the essential fatty acids, you cannot eat saturated fats with reckless abandon, simply because at the neuronal level and within all our cells, there needs to be a perfect balance of essential fats and saturated fats and monounsaturated fats to make sure that that cell membrane is as flexible as possible. It also limits the need for increased cholesterol production, because cholesterol also tries to make that cell membrane as flexible and malleable as possible. Important. What do we want with our brain? Increased connectivity and more energy. The increased connectivity will naturally occur when you have enough of the right fats, because those synapses will be made up of the right fats, and every single neuronal membrane will be very flexible and very agile and very malleable, which is exactly how we want the brain to be. We want the brain to be able to respond optimally to any input, whether external or internal, to be able to make the best of how it operates. So these fats are all really important, but the one I want you to focus on are the polyunsaturated fats, because those are the ones the body cannot make. The body can make monounsaturated fats, so enjoy them, but don't enjoy them believing that they are essential fats, because they're not. Enjoy saturated fats, make sure that they are organic if possible, because fats unfortunately attract pesticides. Pesticides accumulate in fat, and with a very, very high percentage of fat in the brain, we don't want pesticides accumulating there. lots of evidence to suggest that's a very bad idea if we want to keep our brain intact into old age. So people say to me, so what's the clue? How do I know what fats to consume? And this is the simplest answer. Whenever you find a fat in plastic and you can see the oil, don't consume it. Because any fat that has been put into plastic is firstly leaching chemicals from the plastic into the fat, which it does much more efficiently than it does from water. And also it has been processed to a very high degree so that it stays shelf stable. Those fats are really, really toxic to the brain, and we don't need them in any other cell either. So that's the first rule: avoid any fats and oils in plastic, and if you can see them. Any company or farmer or producer that takes the time to produce a fat and put it into a dark glass container knows what they're doing. Purchase products from those people. So we're back again to the synapse. You know, when I explain to people how powerful the right fats are, they often don't believe me initially, but I have helped people to reduce their medication. One of the examples being medication for ADHD, simply because the right fats help the brain to work more efficiently. So when people tell me that they are using some form of pharmaceutical to help their brain function better, whether it's an antidepressant or an anxiolytic, I always say to them, there is no evidence to show that this is the case, because there's no randomized control group to show, okay, if you're taking an antidepressant, essential fats will help. However, we know from what happens within the brain that it just starts working more efficiently. So if you have something like that on your radar, just keep this in mind. I'm not saying reduce your medication. I'm saying make your brain really well nourished first, and then discuss it with a practitioner who knows what they're talking about, to slowly taper off that medication if that's possible for you. And even if it isn't, your brain will still be functioning optimally, because these neurotransmitters will be able to be synthesized and jump across a synapse that is healthy and flush and robust with the right fats. So the next slide is a very busy slide, and I try to avoid having busy slides in my presentations because I know that people read them and then they don't listen to me. So I'll give you a moment to read the slide and then I'll explain it. So what I'm speaking about on this slide, and I want you to take away, is that the body takes compounds or chemicals and then uses cofactors, which are actually vitamins and minerals from our food, to create something more, like hormones and neurotransmitters. So it's kind of like coming into a production factory. We do something to it, and when it leaves, it's something different. And that's exactly what happens in the body and the brain, which we're specifically interested in here. So we eat amino acids, we get them from plants and we get them from flesh, and they get converted into adrenaline and serotonin and melatonin and all the other neurotransmitters that we make. How does it happen? It happens through a magical process using the nutrients on the last line of the slide. B1 to 12, vitamin C, copper, iron, manganese, magnesium, selenium, and zinc. Okay. Now, the secret that I want you to take away, and if this is the only thing you take away today, besides the fact that fats are seriously important, I want you to take away the fact that these nutrients are used not once, not twice, but continuously in the body, while the body and brain are making neurotransmitters, while the body is taking carbohydrates and turning it into energy, and while the body is taking cholesterol and turning it into cortisol and hormones. And these are just a few examples. So these nutrients are used continuously. Taking a dietary supplement once a day and not eating well does not serve this process, because it's an ongoing process. If you have to make adrenaline, which most people have been making in vast quantities in the last 18 months, and if you have to make cortisol, which is the long-lasting hormone after initial adrenaline synthesis, you will end up feeling exhausted if your diet isn't optimal. Why? Because the brain will naturally prioritize making adrenaline over making serotonin and melatonin. When a tiger is chasing you, your brain isn't going to say, okay, I need a bit of serotonin now because it's sleep time. And serotonin is the foundation of melatonin to allow you to fall asleep and stay asleep. That is not what your brain is saying. Your brain is saying, hold on a second. There's a tiger chasing us and we have to get away from the tiger. There is no time for serotonin synthesis and neurotransmitter synthesis of any other kind. So we end up depleting our body because energy isn't a priority besides running away from the tiger, which eventually becomes exhausting. This is why so many people have felt foggy from a cognitive perspective. They haven't been able to string complex thoughts together. I've spoken to people who read a sentence and then they've got to reread the sentence. They haven't been able to read complex books because their brain just feels too tired. This is why the brain will always prioritize survival hormones and neurotransmitters over ones that help us feel calm, relaxed, and sleep, and also over ones that allow us to feel focused and be able to concentrate and lay down memories and recall memories. Survival is the priority. So when I show you this slide, you will understand that most people have been chased by a tiger for the last 18 plus months. That's what it feels like, because the brain has been dealing with an enormous amount of uncertainty, which the brain hates. And the prefrontal cortex has been continuously saying, when is the end date? How does the end of this look? What can I do to predict what it will look like? Are there any plans I can put in place? So the challenge is that the body and brain are only meant to experience stress for between 30 and 60 seconds. The truth of the matter is that within that time frame, the tiger either got you, ate you, and you didn't need a stress response anymore, or otherwise you got away from the tiger and you didn't need to feel stressed anymore. The challenge today is that this tiger hasn't let us go and is constantly chasing us. But there's an added challenge, which a lot of people haven't realized, is that the prefrontal cortex has become involved in this response, in the stress response, because when the tiger is chasing you, you either get eaten or you get away, and you don't ruminate over that. You carry on with your day. That is how we were meant to respond in a stressful situation. That is not happening anymore. The tiger is chasing us, and so we continue thinking about it. What can we do? How can we plan? You know, all the different things that the brain is trying to do with this very sophisticated prefrontal cortex that we have, that is now battling to make sense of a situation that seems really senseless. We've never experienced this before. We don't have any memories to recall. When people speak about the Spanish flu, we don't have a memory to call on and say, okay, this is what happened there, this is what can happen here. So the brain is absolutely exhausted with this backwards and forwards of adrenaline synthesis, which it's using nutrients for, the prefrontal cortex, which is the greediest part of the brain, because the brain uses 25% of the energy that we consume and more when we're stressed. The prefrontal cortex, which is only 10% of the brain total volume, uses 25% of that 25%. So it is the part of the brain that is truly the most energy demanding and greedy of an already very, very greedy organ. So this constant backwards and forwards to the prefrontal cortex about what the situation has left us with and how we're trying to make sense of it is extremely exhausting for the brain, but primarily for the prefrontal cortex, which is a huge challenge for leaders, because that's the part of the brain that we really rely on to give us innovative thoughts. And, you know, as we discussed at the other slide. So just to make this really simple for you, every single time you have that spurt of adrenaline, your hypothalamus, your pituitary gland, and your adrenal glands jump into action. And at a later slide, you're going to see what this actually means for energy within your brain. Because every single time this happens, which we call the HPA response, your body is automatically pumping blood glucose into your muscles to run away from that tiger. But there's no tiger to run away from. So as a number of people have during this period of time realized that when they exercise, they feel a whole lot better. And why is that? Logically, that adrenaline's getting some kind of output with the exercise. But that's not, you know, that's not the topic of today's conversation. But that's one of the reasons why that adrenaline is getting a way to be used by the muscles. So I just want to touch on this slide for a moment because it can highlight what stress has done to us. If you have a look at this slide, it's divided into two parts. We have the parasympathetic nervous system, which is easily understood as the rest and digest part of our nervous system. And we've got the sympathetic nervous system, which we can understand as the stress part of our nervous system. Something that a lot of people have said to me over the last 18 months is that their eyes are really sore. And I've noticed that with myself too. And it's not just all these Zoom calls that make our eyes sore. When we're under a state of constant stress, our eyes are continuously dilated because we're looking for that tiger. And that means that our eyes are continuously on. They're never resting. And so at the end of the day, your eyes can really be tired because of that. But the other things that happen with our sympathetic nervous system being switched on all the time is salivation is inhibited, which means that impacts our digestive system. So that is a huge challenge because when we eat, we're not getting the digestion and absorption required for optimal body and brain function. And then, of course, glucose release is stimulated by the liver to get energy into the muscles as well. And you can see the other things that happen there. The parasympathetic nervous system on the other side is really challenged in these circumstances because it's not getting the nutrients required to be able to switch it on. And it's also having adrenaline pump through our bodies all the time. So we're never in a state of relaxed calm, which is what the brain really appreciates. And that's where the real creativity of the brain steps in. And I'm sure you all have many stories to recall about moments where you were very relaxed and calm and suddenly into your brain jumped a really creative idea. It had the time and space to do that because the parasympathetic nervous system was switched on. The challenge is, and a lot of people aren't aware of it, is that the parasympathetic nervous system is actually more robust than the sympathetic nervous system because it was supposed to be switched on more often than the sympathetic nervous system. And when people use the word burnout, that is actually what they're referring to because the sympathetic nervous system, not as robust as the parasympathetic nervous system, is burning out more quickly because we're using up all of its resources first. We can't bring the parasympathetic nervous system into account. So a quick tip with my psychology hat on and a bit of neurophysiology, you cannot have your SNS on while you're laughing. So I encourage all of you to spend a lot of time laughing because that naturally switches your parasympathetic nervous system on and you don't even have to think about stress while you're doing that. Suddenly your PNS is on and you can actually give yourself a break. So think about that for a moment. Anyone has a good joke, put it in the chat and we'll speak about that in a moment. So as I mentioned, when the SNS is on all the time, our digestive system is truly impacted. And this is a huge conversation because we all know, if we're aware of how the brain works, that at the moment, there's a huge amount of information and interest around how the gut impacts brain function. So I'll distill it into a very, very simple understanding. The minute we have high levels of cortisol, that impacts both the bacteria in our gut and changes the ratio of good versus a little bit of bad that we do need. And it also changes the integrity of the gut lining. When those two things happen, unfortunately, an inflammatory response is set off, which gets into our bloodstream and travels all the way up to our blood-brain barrier, which is just as compromised by that inflammatory response. And then when inflammation jumps into the brain, which it can and does do when we're very stressed, it then causes an unfortunate domino effect in the brain as well, starting a cascade of inflammation. And that is how mood disorders are linked to brain function. It's one of the pathways, one of the mechanisms by which our brain gets impacted by our gut. So sorting out our gut is extremely important. And if over the last 18 months you have felt that your digestive system has definitely deteriorated, this is something to keep in mind. And at the end of the session, I will share a gift with you that will help your gut as well as your brain work more optimally. So I thought I would just mention this here because a lot of people are curious about immune function and the brain and stress. You know, stress has to affect our nervous system because our nervous system is what keeps us alive. That impacts our sleep, which is our circadian rhythm. That then influences our hormones, which is our endocrine system, which is directly related to our immune system. So I've taken a lot of complex science and put it into this simple slide. Once we start eating to improve stress resiliency, we then have this beautiful domino effect that impacts everything, including our immune system. We are not just eating well to be able to think more clearly and be better leaders. We are wanting to eat well so that we can be healthy and whole across the spectrum and across our lifespan. It's just the way we're doing it is aimed at a particular outcome, but it also has the wonderful effect of impacting the whole of our body and our brain, including our immune system. But what happens when people are really stressed? One of the things that happens is they reach for highly processed food. Now, there are a number of reasons that this happens, and I'm not going to go into the psychology of it, but I will explain the neurophysiology of it. When we reach for a highly processed food and we consume that food, we may not even be aware of it, but there are opioids that are released inside our body and our brain, which we call endogenous opioids. That's the ones we make ourselves. And these opioids, for a very short period of time, lower the HPA stress response. So that stress response that we've been feeling with the tiger chasing us, suddenly we feel calmer because the HPA response has been reduced. What happens over time, because we are such sophisticated, special, unique creatures, we learn that we can do this at will. So we reach for that highly processed food because we instinctively understand that that emotional, that stress relief is imminent, only for a short period of time. But we're all old enough here to know that there is no free lunch. So unfortunately, once we do that, what happens is that our blood glucose also spikes very quickly. And what happens when our blood glucose spikes? Adrenaline goes up as well. And what happens when adrenaline goes up? We know that nutrients are required to make that adrenaline. You're all on the same page as me now. Unfortunately, that highly processed food has to lead to a blood glucose dip. More bad news. When blood glucose dips really, really quickly, because there is no place in the brain to store energy, the brain sends a message and says, hey, that blood glucose has dipped a little bit too much now. I'm sending adrenaline into the bloodstream to get it up again. And then it goes up again. When we dehydrated, cortisol levels go up as well. When we don't sleep well, blood glucose goes up as well. When we go for long periods of time, while we are very stressed and we don't eat, naturally adrenaline is released and we go up and down as well with the blood glucose. But the thing that most people have noticed is that they also start putting on weight. Because the more times blood glucose is erratic, going up and down, the greater the chances are that any excess carbohydrates you eat, regardless of why you're eating them, will be dumped as fat. That's just the biochemistry of how excess carbohydrates are used. So I'd like you to keep in mind, keeping our blood glucose stable is one of the most important things we can do for brain function, because when our blood glucose is stable, we think clearly. Our focus and concentration is stable. Our mood is stable. We're not running off to grab something to give us a quick energy release, which will also happen if we rely on coffee, because the same thing will happen here, as you saw from the coffee slide. So keeping our blood glucose stable is extremely important if we want to get our brain to function optimally. That is connection and energy. Making sure that those connections work is with the fat and the energy that we need to be able to make sure that those neurotransmitters work in tandem. So you may be saying, okay, so what kind of food does that look like? And it's really, really simple. The kind of food that we should be consuming is very, very colorful, naturally colorful, mostly fresh produce. If you're going to eat meat, which I'm definitely not against, because there are very important nutrients that you can only get from flesh and animal products like B12, iron, and possibly zinc as well, which are all important for adrenaline synthesis and serotonin and melatonin synthesis, then that's perfectly fine. If you're a vegetarian, watch out for deficiencies in those nutrients. But mostly our diet should be made up of a lot of plant foods because they've got a lot of antioxidants in them, which are critically important for the brain, and also a lot of anti-inflammatory compounds, which are also critical, especially when stress is bathing our body and our brain, because that causes huge damage to the neurons. So colorful food is what we should be focusing on. Perfect meal, as long as you've got the right fats in there as well with nuts and seeds. A little bit of flesh is great as well. All that fiber is helping support the good bacteria in your gut to keep the bacteria happy and keep the gut lining intact to make sure that compounds don't jump into the bloodstream, travel to the brain and cause inflammation. People ask about fish. I no longer recommend fish, although salmon has long been recognized as a great brain food. Our oceans are full of heavy metals, PCBs and dioxins, which unfortunately lodge in fatty tissue and are neurotoxic. So if you really want to make sure that your brain is functioning optimally, do not rely on this kind of fat and this kind of fish, because it is no longer considered brain food. If you live in a pristine, beautiful part of the world where there's absolutely no toxins in the ocean, then that's a different story. I've yet to discover that place because I'm moving there next. But honestly, do not rely on fish as brain food. There are many other sources of food that we can eat quite happily, including legumes, including lots of plant foods that also have amino acids in them and make up complete proteins. So do not rely on this, as a lot of the myth is around salmon and fatty fish being really, really good for the brain. We don't live in a clean world anymore. And these toxins are really damaging, especially to our very sensitive neural tissue. Another thing about eating, which is important, is to eat in community. Eat with your loved ones, eat with your friends. I know with COVID, it's been a huge disaster, but eating alone in front of the TV, watching the news is the worst thing you could do for your digestive system and your brain. So don't do that. Even if you eat alone, rather sit alone and listen to some lovely music. Allow your digestion to be optimal, because that supports your brain's optimal functioning. I would be remiss if I didn't mention water. As I mentioned at the blood glucose slide, when we experience dehydration, there's a lot of research to show that our brain is compromised in terms of its functioning capacity. But also what happens is that cortisol goes up when we don't drink, when we dehydrated. So it's as if the brain, cheers, Alexis. It's as if the brain sends a message again to the body, go and look for water, because your brain needs water. And just as an aside, as we get older, the part of our brain that registers thirst becomes less and less efficient at doing so. This is one of the reasons why elderly people in a very hot climate often suffer from dehydration. They don't really realize that they are thirsty. Something else happens when we are really thirsty. Sometimes people mistake that thirst for hunger, and then they reach for food when it isn't really food that they need. The brain is saying, give me water. So we've come to the end of the presentation. So now you know how stress impacts your brain. You understand that when your brain is focused on survival, the synthesis of adrenaline and cortisol is going to be primary, using up all sorts of nutrients that are needed to make neurotransmitters, which allow the brain to rest and sleep, and also allow the brain to be focused and concentrate and learn and recall and be innovative because of the greedy prefrontal cortex. And when you're really, really stressed, you are not able to be calm and relaxed, which allows the brain to function optimally. So you understand what stress does there. And now you also know how important blood glucose is. When your blood glucose isn't stable, you're also going to be suffering from compromised cognitive capacity. You now understand what nutrition does. Those nutrients come from food. The food that we eat makes sure that we have enough of those nutrients to be able to do all the jobs that they do. So I have spoken to so many people over the last 18 months who've said to me, but I really feel like I need a treat. And I really feel like I need to reward myself, because I'm working from home and life is difficult with all of these challenges. And I'm not a person to say, let's deprive ourselves. However, we can still eat delicious food and still make sure that it's healthy. So if you were with me in person, I would be handing out at this point in time a beautiful jar of homemade chocolate treats, which are delicious. You don't feel like you're deprived at all, and they contain a secret ingredient as well. So if you think that eating healthy is about deprivation, I'm here to tell you that's not the case at all. But we need to make sure that our diet is really optimal if we want our brain to function well. And so you now understand what makes a healthy brain: emotional stability and mental clarity. Just to end on quite a sobering note, I know that today's focus was on leaders and, to get our brain really well connected and to make sure our energy is high. It's very important to keep in mind that the brain, because of its sophistication, is able to do these brilliant workarounds for decades before we start seeing degradation in the brain. What I'm saying is that the course of mental decline is a slow one, but when the effects become noticeable, when the symptoms become really noticeable to you, so much damage has occurred that it's virtually impossible to repair the brain then. It's done everything in its power to make sure that it was coping and doing all these workarounds when it wasn't getting what it needed. And one of the things that it needs is for us to be able to become stress resilient. And one of the best ways to do that, the fundamental, foundational way to do that, is to make sure that we are supplying all the nutrients that it needs, so that from a structural point of view, it is sound and robust. And on top of that, we can then build all sorts of other strategies, but it's really, really hard to push a car when the tires are flat. And I wouldn't encourage anyone to try that. So although the focus has been on leadership, and the focus has been on being able to maximize our cognitive capacity, I want you at the back of your mind to keep there, really to keep there, that what you're also doing is protecting your brain for the future. Because if you've ever seen somebody who loses their brain and their brain function, you do realize that you lose yourself. So although the topic has been, as I said, leadership, mindfulness, focusing on improving cognitive capacity and maximizing it, keep in mind, you're actually looking after your brain for a lifetime if you follow this procedure. So let's leave that right there. I've got a gift for you, as I said. I put together the 7-point checklist because people were saying to me, so what do you do every day, Delia? You know all this stuff. So what are you doing? So I put together this checklist of the things that I do every day to make sure that I allow my parasympathetic nervous system to function more than my sympathetic nervous system. And I've also got a checklist in this checklist to allow you to check off all the things that should be on your plate every time you eat, so that you don't have an excuse to say, oh, I don't know about that. Because today you've learned exactly what should be on your plate. You'll be able to go and tick them off as you go through this checklist. So please have a look at this. I encourage you to download it so that you can get all the information in there and do what I do every day. And you can find me at my website as well. Break away with all the questions.
Yeah, fantastic, Delia. I will admit, when I saw your first slide with the coffee cup pop up straight away, I had a mild panic attack thinking that you can tell me blanket rule, no caffeine. So I'm glad you clarified that. I do have some fantastic questions that have come through. But I did just want to start with caffeine because I assume most of us in the room here are coffee drinkers. Now, I noticed when you were talking about it, Delia, you mentioned that, I guess, being mindful of what our caffeine habit looks like is really where we start to understand, whether or not we're using it as a way to boost energy through the day or whether or not we're using it as a ritual-based thing. But I wondered if you could maybe help us. Is there a way that we can consume caffeine perhaps at the start of the day and maybe supplement that with some fatty foods around it to help our body kind of uptake that, or our brain uptake that differently?
It's a good question. And I don't know any research that suggests that fat, any robust research. I know that, some people stir butter into their coffee, right, and that works really well, but N equals 1 isn't a robust sample. So I would suggest that people just figure out what works for them. As I mentioned about saturated fat, just as an aside, people that sit on the couch and don't do a lot of exercise can't eat a lot of saturated fat. And also people that don't have enough essential fatty acids can't eat a lot of saturated fat, because otherwise their cell membranes aren't flexible and malleable, which is definitely what we want for every cell, specifically neurons. But there is research to show that eating something sweet with coffee is very, very bad, because that affects blood glucose and actually helps you put on weight. So that's not what you want to do. So don't have a cup of coffee with a donut. Rather have a cup of coffee just by itself. What my favorite is to put coconut cream or coconut milk into the coffee. You get a great flavor, a little bit of sweetness, but I use decaf because I know real coffee doesn't work for me. And I know where to get really good organic, no chemical decaf. So if anyone wants to know, let them just shoot you a question, and I will happily give you that link. And it is Australian made, so people will have to, find a way to get there, but it's the best that I can find. He's as obsessed about coffee as I am about essential fats. So when people feel that they are relying on coffee to help their brain think clearly, that's when they're in trouble.
Yeah.
Okay. So that is something just to keep in mind. That means our mitochondria within the neurons are suffering. They are not getting the energy that they need. And that's what's important to keep in mind. Then people can start substituting with a green drink, for example, an organic green drink with lots of nutrients in it. It definitely doesn't taste as great as coffee, but it's a good start. And the other things that they can do as well. But just to keep in mind, sometimes we need to be our own detectives for how we're doing. And that's just important to keep in mind.
Yeah, and that's great, Dilly. And that's definitely something I realize in my own life and in my own leadership journey has been really critical, is actually sort of taking a moment to be mindful of how I am feeling and what that's actually coming from. Because I think in leadership, we so often address everything at the surface level. And, we mentioned stressful meetings, constant Zoom calls, the mounting pressure on us in leaders right now. And I can say for sure, for me, my default is to jump up to the kitchen and snap a few blocks of lint off before I sit back down for the next meeting to kind of pep myself up for that next meeting again. So when we can sort of tune into, okay, why am I feeling very drained in that situation? We sort of start to empower ourselves to, start to look at what's actually underlying at the foundation and what we might be missing there and what we can do about it.
Well, one of the things I do between my meetings, and I show the exercise in that 7-point checklist, I've got a little thing that I do to go and stretch my shoulders, because, we end up hunched over and we don't get enough blood supply and oxygen to our brain. So that's one of the things I do. But I must tell you, and I saw one of the questions was about dark chocolate. There is nothing wrong with having a little bit of dark chocolate as a treat, but it needs to be 70% and if possible, organic.
Yeah.
A little bit.
Yeah.
And enjoy that. Put it in your mouth and be mindful. Close your eyes and actually experience it. Don't chew it and swallow it. This mindfulness business is real and it's true and it does work. And we just need to maximize it now. All the time we've been practicing mindfulness. Now's the time where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, absolutely. And it does really tie into this idea of being responsive rather than reactive in their moments when we're feeling stressed or depleted or whatever the case is. Now, I'm just going to jump into a few questions here. We had one come through earlier from someone who wanted to know around the difference between fructose and processed sugar. And maybe if you can highlight a little bit of the importance. I guess we saw a lot of images around healthy fruits, which do contain sugar, fructose. So can you kind of maybe, I know you did touch on some of those unhealthy sugars earlier, but just differentiate a little bit for us there?
There are a few things about fruit. A lot of people say fruit is bad. Fruit used to be better before it was genetically modified. And the genetics isn't the important. It's just that we've modified fruit to make it very much more sweet than it used to be. Point number one. Point number two, it travels far distances. So it's lost a lot of its benefit by the time it reaches us. And three, we're eating a lot of fruit when it's not in season. So those are three reasons why fruit may not be the best solution for everybody under all circumstances. But fruit is definitely better than a donut. However, if people are very, very stressed and they're craving a lot of sweet and they're eating a lot of sugar, I know somebody who was eating 7 and 8 bananas a day. And this person was really in a huge state because she thought that bananas were healthy. And, bananas are healthy, but not 7 or 8 a day. And then she was eating dates on top of that. So this woman was really not coping. But you see, this is the problem with the myths of nutrition. People really get very confused. So yes, fruit is better than processed sugar, but too much very sweet fruit is not going to serve you if you're feeling very stressed and you're craving it and you're eating it at random. That's not the aim of the exercise. Rather have things like berries, even things like pineapple. I really encourage people to eat a lot of berries, and frozen are fine because they are really not very, very sweet, but they're loaded with antioxidants and anti-inflammatory compounds. But yeah, processed, no good.
Great.
From
And I have
fruit,
another
much
question.
better.
Yeah, great. And I have another question here that's come through around, and I know you touched on this idea of plastics and the way we store our food and store our oils earlier. Is there much of a difference between, because obviously in the Western cultures now, we can buy everything pre-packed and frozen. So what is the difference there for us if we are choosing frozen foods over fresh foods?
Look, fresh organic is always best, picked as close as possible to ripeness. We don't live in a perfect world. I would rather prefer people to have frozen whole food. And that's what in the courses that I run, I teach people how to do that, have frozen fresh whole food like peas and sweet corn and so on, not the ready-made food, because the ready-made food has to have preservatives in it. It generally has colorants and flavorants in it. So that's not the aim of what we want, because that is also toxic to the brain. So as close to nature as possible, frozen is fine.
Sure. Now, I do have a question here on cortisol and weight loss and weight gain. And the question is that this particular person finds that exercising through cardio, quite often they gain weight down the track because it does increase cortisol in the body. Now, I know that your forte is in neuroscience and nutrition, but do you have any advice for managing that cortisol to maximize that sort of weight loss in that instance?
This is a good question. I think that I would not call this my area of expertise, but I would think that this person's level of stress was already high. Okay. And what may be required is exercise that doesn't increase cortisol, things like Tai Chi, things like yoga, things that actually calm down the central nervous system instead of doing the opposite. That may not always be the case, but until this person's adrenal response has calmed down, it may be the best response right now. And then that will also dampen appetite. But remember that serotonin is very much involved in appetite regulation, and serotonin, peripheral serotonin, 80% of it, which is made in our gut, relies on the right gut bacteria. So if the right gut bacteria is there, weight loss and appetite suppression becomes natural with exercise. If the right gut bacteria is not there, that's a challenge. So I would suggest fixing gut bacteria, lowering the cortisol response from different forms of exercise, and then getting back to other forms when that has been healed.
Beautiful. Thank you. Guys, any more questions coming through there? We did have a question earlier, and it's not really directly, it is related to what we're speaking about, but I think it has a broader context than that. And that is the concept of quite often university students, for instance, who are under a lot of stress with exams. They have, a lot of time pressure. Quite often they don't have a lot of time pressure allowing them to work. So they're financially under constraints as well. And I certainly know when I was in university, I turned to a lot of bad habits around food to, they felt cheaper and it was easier because you're in stress, right? So the question was, how can we maybe help with that? So I guess that, is a little more difficult because I think it kind of asks from an institutional level as well. How can we address maybe affordability of some of these foods? But perhaps we can look at it from the perspective of, if you were someone on a limited budget, what are some key things that we can do to improve our nutrition without breaking the bank maybe?
Okay, first thing, find the local farmers market and go and frequent that. Because that fresh produce is really important. Legumes and things like quinoa are not expensive, and they can be produced to make delicious meals, magnificent curries, delicious pates, lovely stews, all really nutrient dense and not expensive either. The other thing to do is really prioritize one's time. And I say that as a student that's done a lot of study. When your time is prioritized and you really know what you're doing, the stress level immediately drops. And I speak to students at the moment, and they really battle because they procrastinate on social media. And when you procrastinate on social media, you're doing a number of things wrong, because what you're doing, you're giving yourself a quick dopamine release every time you look at social media, which is exactly the opposite of how the brain rewards you when you study. So I think priorities are really important, but the dietary part of that is good as well. And then the other thing that I suggest is, if people can, go and get a blood test to see what you're deficient in. When I work with people in my group programs, the first thing I get them to do is take a photograph of all these dietary supplements. Then we see what they can throw away, and they save a lot of money. And then the second thing we do is we make sure we look at what their values are. Okay. That's very important because that then drives your priorities. But really, getting blood tests done is extremely important as well, because that tells you, then you're not working with a moving target. Then you know, hey, I'm deficient in this. What can I do about it? And then you work with someone who's experienced in that. But especially for students, I've worked with students who are severely deficient in some of the nutrients required for focus and concentration, like zinc and magnesium. We want to address that really, really quickly so that they can quickly feel competent and proactive and productive when they study.
Fantastic. I hope that answers that question. Now, okay. I do know before the session started, Delia, we wanted to touch on supplements, and I do have a question here around the best way to consume probiotic to maintain a healthy gut. And I know that you mentioned earlier you also wanted to elaborate a little more on some of the supplements here, so perhaps that's a good segue for us.
Okay, excellent. Firstly, I believe that probiotics can work, and I believe that they can be very helpful. But as I'm a first principles kind of person, while a person is finishing their probiotic, I suggest they start eating more prebiotic foods, because the prebiotics actually feed the good bacteria, so they proliferate. And then you don't have to have probiotics after a period of time. So that's what I suggest, more prebiotic food. If you're going to use a probiotic, what I suggest you do is actually open the capsule, put it under your tongue and swallow it. Allow it to disperse in your mouth and then swallow, because we need good bacteria all the way from our mouth to the end region. We don't just need it in our gut. That's why we call it a microbiome. So that's, most people are not consuming probiotics like that. If people get a little bit icky and they don't want to do that with it, let them have the probiotic after a meal, not before. If you have a probiotic before a meal, your stomach acid can actually degrade it before you actually get the benefit. And that goes against what the labeling says, and it goes against what the person in the health shop will tell you, but that's just what we know happens. That was the probiotic question. So now we're going to get onto the dietary supplements.
Before we do, what are some of the prebiotics that we should be consuming?
Okay, yes, prebiotics are anything from the onion, leek, garlic family, okay? Also things like artichokes are fantastic prebiotics, and any food that's got a lot of fiber in it. So for example, cauliflower. You have your cauliflower, you have the florets. Take the leaves and the stalks of the cauliflower and chop them up really finely and toss them in a rice dish. You get all the fiber, which feeds the good bacteria as well. So there are lots of ways to incorporate more fiber in your diet, but those from the onion family and artichokes are really two of my favorite.
Beautiful. So do we want to touch a little bit more on some of those supplements then, Delia?
One of the things that I can just give to people as a guiding principle, because when I work with people, we actually dive deep into what they need and what they should be taking. But a primary, like a kind of like overriding principle to use is, what is the form of the supplement? So when I look at the form of a supplement, my primary preferred form is either in liquid or in powder form. After that, capsule, and last on the list is tablet. And the reason for that is a tablet has to have a certain type of fat in it so that the manufacturer's machines don't get clogged up as those tablets are being punched through the machine. We've all got an imagination, so we can imagine how that works. That fat may be compromising digestive integrity. So I really prefer liquid, powder, or capsule before tablet. Sometimes you can't avoid a tablet, but then there are ways to work around that. But that's the overriding principle of taking supplements. After a really deep dive into dietary supplements for female stress, it was horrifying to me after reading thousands of papers that I only came away with 14 papers to use in a systematic review. And there is very little evidence for a lot of the dietary supplements that are sold to manage stress. Very little evidence for the ordinary over-the-counter dietary supplements. If you want to supplement properly, you really have to do it with the guidance of someone who knows what they're talking about, because otherwise the chances are that you're really just wasting your money. I ended up saving a lot of money by doing a PhD.
Who would have thought education would be cheaper than supplements in Australia, huh? Now, I also have a question here around dairy and perhaps their impact on the brain. And also if you can maybe touch on a little bit the difference here around things like full fat, skim, and I mean, there's such a range of milk varieties around at the moment. Okay,
there are two things to keep in mind. The fact that you'd find in any dairy would be saturated fat. And once again, the same principles apply to that. Saturated fat isn't dangerous unless you sit on the couch and unless you don't have enough essential fats, then it becomes a challenge. And also it needs to be organic if possible because of the pesticides. The second thing is that, milk is really there to grow baby calves quickly. And it doesn't have magnesium in it, which helps the calcium to be absorbed. So I wouldn't suggest that anybody relies on it for a nutrient dense drink. In other words, people can have a problem with dairy, and that's often the protein in the dairy that causes a problem. And it is actually, as I said, it has got hormones in it which are conducive to quick growth, which human beings do not really need, and cows need that. However, once again, see how you respond. I'm working with a woman at the moment who has just discovered that any dairy is a problem for her digestive health. And I've told her she's doing her brain health a lot of good by not consuming the dairy. We had slowly eliminated it down to dairy as being a problem, but that's not the case with everyone. I have a mother who can eat dairy until the cows come home, excuse the pun, and she doesn't have a challenge, but it doesn't suit me. So it really just a matter of looking carefully. But if you have a problem with dairy, it's affecting your gut and definitely is also affecting your brain, which is a problem.
So I guess it again comes back to that kind of self-ownership on being conscious of how certain things are affecting us. Yeah. So it really does start with our, tuning in and being mindful to how these things are showing up in our mood, our stress levels, our energy levels, and all these sorts of things, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I think everybody loves good news about their bad habits. So when there's an article about how fantastic coffee is, everyone goes, yay, let's have another one of my 8 a day. Or, about dairy, it's fantastic for you. We just need to be more circumspect and go back to the foundation.
Absolutely. And I did once read an article that red wine was equivalent to running 30 minutes. So that was a great one. I've continued running anyway. However, if you cling to things like that, you'll always find something that confirms what you need to hear. Now, I have probably one last question here, Delia, before we let you get on with your day. And that is, what's your kind of overall opinion on things like peanut butter? So processed versions of natural nuts.
Okay, great question. The first thing about peanut butter is actually not a nut. It's actually a legume. It grows under the ground, but we call it a nut, and most people think it's a nut. Second thing about peanuts is that they're very prone to something called aflatoxin, which is a really horrible mold that is toxic to us. And companies have to get rid of that by roasting the peanuts, or trying to, and then in roasting them, they damage the monounsaturated fat. So that's also a challenge. If they're not organic, they can be full of pesticides again as well. So I think, making sure that it's organic is an important thing, not roasted to death. And also making sure it doesn't contain sugar and so on. A little bit of salt is fine, but I don't suggest anybody consumes a whole bottle of peanut butter every day. Don't rely on it as your primary source of protein, in other words. But a peanut butter is fine. I actually make a delicious chocolate ice cream with dollops of peanut butter through it, which is pretty yummy. So I'm not against peanut butter, but just those few things, keep that in mind.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, Delia, we have no more questions coming through at the moment. So I thought I would just do a quick summary from what I've learned so that I can allow you to correct me on any of the information I've taken out of this today. Now, the first thing that I heard you really hone home for us was the fact that we really need to be eating a rainbow diet. And that really needs to be including those 4 different types of fats. So the omega-3s, the omega-6s, the monounsaturated and the polyunsaturated fats. How did I go with that summary?
Polyunsaturated, yes. Monounsaturated, yes. Saturated if we're eating enough of the polyunsaturated. All good.
Great. And so caffeine is not on the banned substances list, but we need to be mindful of our intake. We need to be mindful of how it's affecting our mood through the day. And if we're too reliant on it, we need to look at other ways that we can kind of tone that back and maybe address again that underlying dietary deficit that we might be having that might be causing that crash for us through the day. Is that right?
Absolutely, because that lack of energy is the thing that you must be honing in on. The need for the coffee is the problem.
Beautiful. And the last thing that I guess I really took away from this was this idea of how things are packaged, that actually makes a difference. So looking at what our oil's coming in, making sure they're coming in dark colored glass oils rather than plastic, so they're not absorbing all the junk coming from the plastic that they're in. And also that looking at the way we supplement is really imperative to getting the most from supplements if we're going to go down that path. So looking at first taking them in a liquid form. Secondly, what was your second takeaway on that one? Powder form, then capsules, then tablets. There we go. So is there anything else, Delia, that you really think we need to take away from this?
I think a lot of people have really good intentions to eat well, but I think, when you're tired and when you're stressed, that you don't do that. So for me, being prepared, having that brain shopping list, making sure that your pantry has everything that it needs, making sure your freezer and your fridge have everything that it needs, because then you can throw a meal together really quickly. I find a lot of people say they come to the end of the day, they're really exhausted and they just grab what's convenient. Preparation is 99% of success. And, on the day that you're really, really exhausted, you want to just be able to take something out and make it really quickly and make it yummy. So I teach people how to do that, because that's where most people fall down. Everybody loves the information. Everybody loves the idea, but to take it and action it is where the hard yards is. So I hold people's hand while they do that, so that then they get to the point where they have enough energy and they don't feel shattered at the end of the day, because none of us need decision fatigue when it comes to meal times.
No, absolutely. And that is definitely, I think, the key thing that drives. I know I can speak from experience in my past life, stress, things like that. At the end of the day, the last thing you want to be doing is cooking, a 3-course fanfare. But good food doesn't have to be difficult. It can be simple, and we don't have to make it something bigger than it needs to be. And we can enjoy the process, I think, is the other thing I heard you mention. Doing it for the right reasons and not putting ourselves on these diet actually will go a long way in helping us make this sustainable change, won't it?
Absolutely. I think a lot of the problem is that people do believe that eating healthy is about deprivation, and it really isn't about deprivation. I eat chocolate. I eat delicious food. When people come into my home and they eat the food, they say, I can't believe it's really healthy, but it is, because I know how to do that now after many years of experience. So I think deprivation is something that stops a lot of people. And then they feel deprived and then they go and eat something that's really bad, whereas they can eat something that's really healthy that still tastes decadent. Yeah. So that's an important part of the story. And so when people go and look at my Instagram, they'll go and see a lot of the food that I make. It's very, very tasty. Nobody feels deprived. I've got chocolate there. I've got lots of yummy stuff. And I don't spend enough time there because I've got other things to do, but people can happily go and check and see that it's not about deprivation. I think that's important to understand.
Absolutely. Now, Delia, just to wrap us up, I know that you've given us our gift of the 7-point checklist. How can people get in contact with you from here if they want to know more about the programs that you offer, your speaking, and other ways to reach out and learn more about what you do?
Thank you, Alexis. Look, I think the first thing is to go and get the 7-point checklist. Just read through it. Start doing some of those things every single day, because once we start lowering that PNS and we start checking off what's on our meals, that's the first step. I do run courses, but I don't have loads of people in the course. I only have 10 people at a time. So 10 people from a group like this would join me, and then over 28 days, we would deep dive into what their food is, what their supplements are, where their challenges are. And then they've got recipes and shopping lists and quick fixes and chocolate treats and everything that go part of the course. But as I said, I don't take a lot of people because I really like to give people, hands-on feedback. So I'll share the link of that with you, and you can share that with the viewers. And people can just go to my website and have a look and see at the articles that I've written. They're really long. They're not the 2-second goldfish articles. They're fully referenced. People can have a look and see, that's what the real science is about. Very happy for them to do that. And then they can find me on Instagram as well. So as I said to you, I will send you the link. I'll only keep it open for 48 hours so that everyone's on the same page. And I've given you a special discount as well for anyone on the course. Anyone on the call. So you can share that with everybody. And then I'm really happy to work with people that way, because I really think it's important that we look after our brains. Most people just don't like the word prevention, and they love the word optimize, but the word prevention is the one they're not mad about. So I try and encourage both at the same time.
It feels harder because it means that we need to take ownership, don't we? So I think that sometimes can be where the stumbling block is.
Absolutely. And so that's why the people that do take my courses are people that are really committed. They either are really scared because something really has happened to them. And I think this is something else, as a therapist, just excuse me while I put my therapist hat on. There are 2 strategies that we use as a therapist. We have a strategy to say, okay, let's change things, or we have a strategy to say, let's accept things. Those are only really two things you do as a therapist. So my role is obviously to change things. And when you change things, everything else has a beautiful positive spin-on effect, because that's where the neural pathways start changing. You know, people just start having new ways of looking at the world. People's mood becomes stable. From a psychological perspective, they actually become new people just because they're getting all the foundations right. So that's why I like working at that intersection. For me, that's the only way to work. I couldn't with integrity be a psychologist anymore when I wanted to say to people, hey, what did you have for breakfast?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I can say personally, I have seen a dramatic change in my own life, overhauling my diet some years ago, introducing things like mindfulness as a support as well. And in terms of stress management alone, I could not imagine living any other way anymore. I could not imagine it. So it's really something you do need to get on board with and experience for yourself. But once you push yourself through that change, it's something that you'll never revert to old ways, I don't think.
Absolutely. And as I said, it's not about deprivation. You can still have a meal that isn't optimal, but you feel so good most of the time that you don't want to compromise that in any way. You know, and as I said, because of the sensitivity of the brain, most people realize the degradation when it's too late to change it. So the people that now stand up and start making a difference will be the ones that benefit long term.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. McCabe, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been such an insightful session. Thank you, Andrew. I can see a few guys clapping there. Thank you so much for everyone for staying on for the full session as well. It's been beyond insightful. I think we've all got something to take away and have a think about. And I do hope that you jump onto that 7-point challenge, and it's so simple. Just take that with you and start looking mindfully at the way that you're eating and the way that's affecting you, and you can start making change right away. So Dr. McCabe, thank you so much again. And thank you guys for joining us for this session.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity, Alexis. Enjoy the afternoon and evening wherever you are, everybody.